The quaint town of Troy, Illinois was shaken to its core on September 13, 2023. A chilling 911 call shattered the morning calm, revealing a horrifying scene of matricide. Norma Carricker, a beloved member of the community, was found dead in her own home, a bungee cord tight around her neck. The prime suspect? Her own son, Neil Howard. Norma, a 60-year-old widow, was known for her infectious laughter and kind heart. She worked tirelessly as a waitress, her two jobs barely making ends meet. Yet, she always put her children first, even providing for her 46-year-old son Neil, who lived in her basement. Neil, unemployed and with a troubled past, was heavily reliant on his mother. He depended on her for financial support, housing, and emotional stability. This dependence, coupled with his history of domestic violence, painted a grim picture for the investigators. The question that haunted the town was simple yet chilling. How could a son commit such a heinous act against the woman who loved him most? Neil Howard was no stranger to trouble. His life was a tangled web of unemployment, financial instability, and a history of violence. He had a documented past of domestic abuse, a red flag that immediately drew the attention of investigators. Those who knew Neil described him as a man consumed by his own demons. He struggled to hold down a job, relying heavily on his mother's dwindling income. This financial dependence, they argued, bred resentment and frustration in him. Neil's anger issues were no secret. His outbursts were unpredictable and often directed at those closest to him, especially his mother. This volatile behavior, coupled with his financial dependence on Norma, painted a disturbing portrait of a man on the edge. The prosecution believed that Neil's simmering resentment towards his mother, fueled by his own personal failures, ultimately culminated in a horrific act of violence. The tension in the Carricker household reached a boiling point on September 12, 2023. Norma had gone on a date with a man named James Carter, a fact that infuriated Neil. He had always been fiercely possessive of his mother, resenting any man who came into her life. Neighbors reported hearing a heated argument erupt from the Carricker home that night. Voices were raised, accusations thrown like daggers. The dispute, according to the prosecution, stemmed from Norma's dating life and Neil's growing frustration over his own circumstances. Later that night, under the cover of darkness, a chilling silence fell over the house. It was then, the prosecution alleged, that Neil made a deadly decision. Driven by a volatile mix of anger, resentment, and possessiveness, he allegedly took a bungee cord and ended his mother's life. The prosecution painted a picture of a man driven to murder by jealousy and rage. They described Neil as a man who had been simmering with resentment for years, unable to cope with his own perceived failures and his mother's growing independence. They argued that Neil, consumed by his own failures and resentful of his mother's independence, lashed out in the most horrific way imaginable. His anger and frustration had reached a boiling point, leading to a tragic and violent outburst. Central to their case was the chilling body camera footage from the responding officers. This footage captured the immediate aftermath of the crime, providing a raw and unfiltered look at Neil's behavior and demeanor. In the video, Neil appeared evasive and nervous, his story riddled with inconsistencies. His inability to provide a coherent account of the events raised further suspicions about his involvement. He claimed a stranger had broken into the house and murdered his mother, but the locked doors and windows told a different story. The physical evidence at the scene contradicted his version of events. Furthermore, the prosecution highlighted the lack of Neil's DNA on the murder weapon, the bungee cord. This absence was suspicious and suggested a deliberate attempt to avoid leaving any trace. They argued that this absence was not a sign of his innocence but rather a calculated move by a cold-blooded killer. Neil's actions were portrayed as premeditated and meticulously planned. Neil, they alleged, had worn latex gloves during the murder, a sign of premeditation. This detail painted a picture of a man who had gone to great lengths to cover his tracks. The prosecution's case rested on the foundation of Neil's troubled past, his volatile relationship with his mother, and the inconsistencies in his alibi. They believed these elements combined to form a compelling narrative of guilt. It was a case built on circumstantial evidence, but the prosecution believed it was enough to convince the jury of Neil's guilt. They were confident that the jury would see through the lies and recognize the truth. The defense team, however, presented a starkly different narrative. They argued that the prosecution had hastily pinned the blame on Neil, ignoring other viable suspects and crucial evidence. Their case centered on casting doubt on the prosecution's timeline and highlighting the lack of a concrete motive. The defense attorneys pointed to the DNA evidence collected from the crime scene. James Carter's DNA, they revealed, was found on the murder weapon, the bungee cord, and under Norma's fingernails. This revelation, they argued, cast serious doubt on Neil's guilt and pointed towards a different perpetrator. Furthermore, the defense called upon witnesses who testified to Norma's open and trusting nature. They described how she often left her doors unlocked and had multiple relationships, suggesting that someone else could have easily entered the house that night. The defense's strategy was clear sow seeds of doubt in the minds of the jury. They presented an alternative narrative, suggesting that the police had tunnel vision, focusing solely on Neil while ignoring other possibilities. The bungee cord, an innocuous object transformed into a murder weapon, lay at the heart of the case. It was a simple piece of equipment, yet it held the power to sway the jury's opinion and determine the fate of the accused. It was a silent witness to the brutal act, its presence in the courtroom a grim reminder of the life tragically cut short. The cord, now encased in an evidence bag, seemed to carry the weight of the entire trial on its twisted strands. The prosecution presented the bungee cord as evidence of Neil's guilt. They meticulously detailed how this seemingly harmless object had been used with lethal intent. They argued that the lack of his DNA on the cord was a sign of premeditation, a calculated move by a killer trying to cover his tracks. The absence of evidence, they claimed, was evidence in itself. The way the cord was tied, they argued, suggested a personal rage, a crime of passion. The knots and loops told a story of anger and betrayal, emotions that could only come from someone close to the victim. The defense, however, saw the bungee cord as their strongest piece of evidence. They believed it could exonerate Neil and point the finger at the real culprit. They highlighted the presence of James Carter's DNA on the cord, suggesting that he, not Neil, had been the one to use it in a fit of jealous rage. This revelation cast doubt on the prosecution's narrative. The bungee cord, a symbol of both the prosecution's and defense's arguments, became a silent battleground in the courtroom. Each side used it to bolster their case, making it the focal point of their strategies. Its presence served as a constant reminder of the brutal act and the high stakes of the trial. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, with every eye fixed on the bungee cord, the silent witness that could decide the outcome. After weeks of intense testimony and compelling evidence presented by both sides, the case went to the jury. 10 women and 2 men held the weight of justice in their hands, tasked with deciding the fate of Neil Howard. The jury deliberated for 3 long hours, carefully considering the evidence and testimonies presented. They reviewed the body camera footage, scrutinized the DNA reports, and weighed the arguments of both the prosecution and defense. Finally, a hush fell over the courtroom as the jury foreman read the verdict: guilty. Neil Howard was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of his mother, Norma Carricker. The verdict sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Neil, his face pale and expression unreadable, remained stoic as the weight of the guilty verdict sank in.